This is Bobby Pandour. He was an acrobat, gymnast and physical culturist who performed across music halls and theatres during the late 19th and early 20th century. Thanks to his striking appearance, he's become something of a visual icon in the history of bodybuilding, with many seeing him as a lesser-known counterpart to the famous Eugen Sandow. With such similarities in their appearance, it's not hard to see why they've drawn comparison. But the men led two very different lives. On one hand, Sandow's legacy and life have been well documented, and on a wider scale, his image has been featured in films and other media. On the other hand, information on Bobby Pandour's life is much more sparse, and he's comparatively lesser known. As a result, he's become a much more mysterious figure, even down to his early death. The National Gallery of France recently digitized these negatives of Pandour. They're part of a larger collection of over 1,000 photographs that were in the collection of Edmond Desbonnet, an entrepreneur, historian, and photographer who pioneered bodybuilding in France. They show Bobby Pandour in more detail than ever before, and give us an insight into why so many felt that he was on par with Sandow at the time. But they also bring a question to mind. Who exactly was Bobby Pandour? Pandour was originally born as Władysław Kucharczyk in Warsaw, Poland in around 1876. I say around because early articles on him do give conflicting dates ranging from 1873 to 1877, but I've gone with 1876 as it was the one that I saw listed most consistently in the sources. He started exercising at a local gym in Warsaw when he was 15. According to a 1902 article, his early training followed the methods of Dr. Władysław Korzeniowski, a teacher and trainer who'd coached the likes of George Hackenschmidt, the Russian Lion, one of the era's most impressive strongmen and wrestlers. Korzeniowski's training methods included the use of simple dumbbell and barbell exercises, with some unorthodox movements like kettlebell throwing, accompanied by core exercises like crunches, sit-ups and leg raises. Another man he followed the training methods of was Louis Attila, the man responsible for training Sandow. Attila advocated for a lighter dumbbell training system, and like Korzeniowski, also emphasized dynamic movements. Interestingly, one other very unique training method that he did claim to use was carrying his brother Ludwig, that's this guy, up and down flights of stairs. But don't worry, we'll come back to Ludwig in a minute. Kucharczyk's early aspirations of becoming a gymnast and acrobat also saw him train using fixed bars and rings, as he built up his athleticism and bodyweight mastery. As far as the adoption of the name Bobby Pandour, this has been largely credited to Professor Attila. It's difficult to know how this came about, since there's no recorded correspondence between the two on this matter. But we do know that by 1898, the then 21-year-old Kucharczyk had started taking up the name Bobby Pandour, as he toured across Europe as an acrobat. It's worth mentioning that this name ended up getting spelt a bunch of different ways, but it was catchier than his birth name. He had a strong start to his career as a performer, as he toured with circuses like Cirque Molière and was given premier performing spots at venues like Paris's Cirque d'Hiver. In 1900, he took things a step further by forming a new act, this time including his brother Ludwig. Told you would come back to this guy. Although he was less experienced and a slightly weaker athlete, Ludwig was still a solid acrobat who made for a good sidekick. Their act included the two of them performing various hand acrobatics, lifting each other overhead flawlessly. They'd also soar through the air on Roman rings and bars. One of their more interesting feats was walking up and down a flight of stairs, while using their feet to support various objects. But the most unique aspect of that act was a muscular posing routine that Bobby Pandour underwent at the end of each show. This became a standout feature of the act, with critics saying that Pandour's physique was so impressive that it actually overshadowed the pair's gymnastic feats. Notably, this part of the routine bore great similarity to the muscular posing routines that Eugen Sandow had become so well known for in the years prior. But much like Sandow, Pandour's image reached much further than the confines of the stage. In early 1902, a series of photographs were taken of him in the city of Bordeaux by photographer André Esquero. The photographs were pretty game-changing for Pandour. They showed him in a range of muscular poses, each demonstrating his physicality and strength. Within months, they'd spread like wildfire across France. Dozens of publications featured them, like Edmond Desbinet's La Culture Physique, France's premier magazine for bodybuilding and strength sports at the time. Desbinet, who had the uppermost authority on physical culture, became a huge advocate for Pandour. A savvy businessman, Desbinet used Pandour's image to market his own gyms, and even sold photos of him out of his magazine. They were even sold as a postcard line, commissioned by photographer and publisher Jacques-Marcel Delboy. As had been the case with Sandow, these postcards proved highly effective for spreading Pandour's name and image. Side note, this is a pretty cool message to send someone. The photos even helped land Pandour work as a model, which would have been a good side gig for a travelling acrobat. Here's him sporting this unique looking garment for an ad. The photos also began to fuel comparisons between Sandow and Pandour. In a time where the physical culture movement was thriving, there was real debate on the kind of physical development that one should aim for. According to stats provided in several articles, Pandour stood at around 5'6" and weighed between 148 and 160 pounds. This made him a smaller man than Sandow, although many felt that his physique was a more visually striking one. Looking at the photos, it's not hard to see why they drew so much public attention, especially since they bore great resemblance to the photos taken of Sandow prior. There's similarly harsh top-down lighting, dramatic poses, and even objects being used to symbolise themes like power and strength. Information on the photographer André Esquero is very limited, so it's hard to know exactly what his thought process was here. It's actually possible that he was emulating previous photographs that he'd seen of Sandow. It's also possible that Edmond Desbinet was somehow involved in the shoot himself, and directed Esquero on how he should take them. The photos hugely bolstered Pandour's popularity in the world of physical culture, although this didn't always translate to lofty commercial success for him and Ludwig in the theatre scene. Early in their career, their success as acrobats varied from place to place. For example, when the two of them toured Britain in 1904 and 5, their success was underwhelming compared to other countries in Europe. But in 1907, the two began to find real success in America, where the vaudeville scene was thriving. Their act had been generally well received in Europe, but in America, their reception was on a whole different level. They managed to secure consistent high-profile spots and make a good living. Having the Pandour Brothers play at your theatre venue for a week would set you back $250, which adjusted for inflation comes to just over $8,000. To compare that to other mid-level acts, it would only cost you slightly more to get an act involving 12 polar bears, which does sound kind of fun, even if 12 is a bit excessive. But needless to say, the Pandour Brothers became a big deal on the American vaudeville circuit, and things went well for the duo. That was until an accident allegedly occurred in Cincinnati in 1915, one so severe that it prevented him from ever performing again. It's difficult to know the exact details of this injury, since all accounts are second-hand retellings. Pandour's last advertised showing in 1915 was for Toledo, Ohio, the same state as Cincinnati. This actually makes it quite plausible for the injury to have occurred sometime in the weeks following, since newspaper records do show that by 1916, he had ceased performing. From here, his brother Ludwig began performing solo under the name Billy Pandour. So no points for creativity there. The last 4 years of Bobby Pandour's life are shrouded in mystery, but we do know that he suffered from a decline of some kind, leading up to his death in 1920. One of the few men to write about the life of Bobby Pandour was Otto Arco, a strongman and wrestler. He reasoned that Pandour's deterioration was simply down to him struggling to adapt to life off stage, stating, "Bobby was neither a drunkard nor a drug addict. He had no disease of any kind that I knew of. He was an artistic soul and tried to be better all the time, and when he couldn't, he simply gave up." This is an interesting, if not vague, account of Pandour's final years, which does lack clarity. On the other hand, Variety magazine articles from the time tell a slightly different story. When Pandour passed away in December 1920, the magazine listed his death was due to a bout of illness which lasted 4 years, though it didn't specify what kind of illness. But earlier articles also point to Pandour suffering from a severe mental decline prior to his death, as the magazine reported that he'd been detained in an asylum for a time. By 1919, the same magazine had opened a fund in Pandour's aid, at which time he was staying at Bellevue Hospital in New York. Once this fund dried out, Pandour's living expenses were supported by a talent agent and production manager called Arthur Buckner. Prior to his death, one columnist referred to Pandour as a man broken in health and spent of spirit. We will never conclusively know what his final years looked like, much like with Eugen Sandow. But Sandow's death was international news and met with grand eulogies about a man who contributed to the cause of physical culture. On the other hand, Pandour's death was briefly covered by just a handful of outlets. The two may have been matched as physical icons, but as their career paths diverged, the gap between their legacies ultimately widened. When comparing Pandour to Sandow, Otto Arco stated, "Only a lack of showmanship prevented Pandour from outshining Eugen Sandow. Pandour was Sandow's greatest rival." But there's one more factor that separated the two in their legacy. Sandow was a great athlete, but he was also an outgoing businessman and entrepreneur who developed products that spanned far and wide. We're talking books, magazines, exercise equipment lines, and even his own gyms. All of these ventures helped position him as a leader in physical culture. He used his publications to tell braggadocious tales of his life and spread his teachings to the masses. Pandour never took on such endeavours or even spoke much of himself in the press, perhaps preferring the life of a performer above all. With few writings of his own, most of his life has been pieced together from spotty second-hand accounts. As a result, Bobby Pandour's influence in bodybuilding is a quieter one, preserved not through words or a grand legacy, but through a striking series of photographs that capture one of bodybuilding's most unique physical icons. Special thanks to the National Library of France, whose digital archives made this video possible. I'd highly recommend checking out their archives if you're into your history. If you enjoyed this, then make sure to subscribe to get notified on my next video. You can also follow me on Instagram, where I post lots of stuff about the history of fitness and bodybuilding.